bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the October 31st, 2023 podcast. Happy Halloween. Affordable rental housing developers, investors, syndicators, property managers, underwriters, and many more are certainly going to want to listen to this episode of Tax Credit Tuesday. What we discuss in today's episode will provide some insights into the maximum rents that owners and developers of tax credit properties will be able to generate in the coming years. This is because in today's episode, we're going to discuss the recent data release that will guide the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, in calculating income limits that they release every year. Income limits that determine the maximum income that tenants at tax credit properties can have and the maximum rents that property owners can charge. Now, HUD is anticipating releasing these income limits on April 1st, 2024. That's a mere 5 months away. Now, many listeners probably already know what I'm referring to when I reference a, quote, data release. That data release is the 2022 American Community Survey data that was recently released by the Census Bureau. This American Community Survey data, also referred to as ACS data, or 2022 ACS data for the 2022 year, is used by HUD to determine the annual income limits every year, including the calculations that HUD refers to as MTSP, or Multifamily Tax Subsidy Projects income limits. These MTSP income limits set the income limits for eligibility for tenants of low-income housing tax credit finance properties, as well as the maximum rents the owners can charge. Now, many podcast listeners are also not going to be surprised to hear that the guest I have on today to discuss these income limits is my partner, Thomas Stagg. At Novogradac, and I know among many of our clients, we consider Thomas the nation's leading expert, outside of HUD that is, when it comes to rent and income limits for tax credit properties. Among the many things that Thomas does at Novogradac is he does lead the Novogradac Income Limits Working Group. The Income Limits Working Group takes a proactive approach to analyzing and commenting on HUD's approach to determining income limits. The working group also provides a forum to discuss various issues, answer frequently asked questions, and share recommended practices. Note that if you want to become a part of that working group, please email cpas@novoco.com. Also, I will include a link to the working group website in today's show notes for the podcast. And our show notes, as you likely know, are available on the Novogradac website. I'd also note that on our website, we have a recent blog post written by Thomas that does discuss two key takeaways from this year's American Community Survey data release. The same two takeaways that we're going to delve into in detail in today's podcast. Now, you can find Thomas's blog post on the Notes from Novogradac page of the Novogradac website, and I'll also include a link to that blog post in today's show notes as well. So what are those two key takeaways or topics? Well, first, we're going to discuss how the recent decline in the annual rate of inflation affects HUD's calculation of income limits. And then the second area we're going to discuss is the various approaches that HUD may adopt to determine the maximum percentage increase in income a given area can experience. Percentage cap that's applied irrespective, or I should say when the underlying ACS income data is higher than that maximum percentage increase. This is often referred to as the income or rent cap, and it is a set maximum percentage increase. And then after discussing these two matters today, those will be more analytical. We'll then delve into something you probably really want to hear, which is Thomas's analysis as to what this data release means for developers and owners going forward. We have a lot of useful insights to share today. So if you're ready, let's get started. Thomas, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be back.
So you're no stranger to any of our regular listeners and viewers. You've been on a double-digit number of episodes. And with today's episode, you'll be our second most frequent guest. So we really appreciate you joining. I know that these episodes are always particularly well listened to or watched on YouTube. So I wanted you to start today's episode by sharing with our audience more about your background and areas of expertise, particularly, of course, as it relates to rent and income limits, the topics we're discussing today.
Yeah. So this is going to be a milestone podcast, I guess, since I'm in second place now.
Yeah.
So I started Novogradac. I just celebrated my 20th anniversary as well. So a lot of milestones lately. But I work in all things LIHTC. So anything dealing with local housing tax credits, I work with that. I mainly work with developers, kind of soup to nuts, right? So I'm helping a developer do initial underwriting applications for tax credits, final cost search, kind of all the way through the life cycle, then even helping them with their year 15 exit and then doing a brand new resyndication. So I want to be kind of touching all parts of your projects, but more applicable to today's episode, I'm also the person who's responsible for updating and maintaining our rent and income limit calculator. Because of that, very early on in my career at Novogradac, I had to really dive deep and understand HUD income limits and how that flow into our calculator, especially in 2008 when HUD came out with, well, when HERA came out with HERA Special and the hold harmless and all those things. That's really when my HUD expertise kind of took off out of necessity. And so I'm just naturally curious about those things as well. So I love being able to delve into that methodology and understand it.
So thank you for that. And we at Novogradac and all of our clients appreciate the fact that you're delving into it. So let's move now to the first of the two key takeaways or discussion points from the Census Bureau's release of the 2022 American Community Survey data. And that has to do with the rate of inflation. So the rate of inflation is still high based upon what it was 3 or 4 years ago, but there has been a recent decline in the annual rate of inflation. And that recent decline does affect HUD's calculation of income limits. So if you could explain the impact that it has to our listeners, and I'd say with a mind to the impact on the 2024 income limit calculations as compared to what the calculations were in 2023.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of give you the high level takeaway up front is this decline in inflation will serve as a headwind to income limit increases. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you get the special benefit of having some cheat sheets up in the corner because we talk about a lot of acronyms and things like that. So I give us some cheat sheet on the corner of my background here. But to understand that how big of an impact this slowdown inflation is going to have, we first need to understand how income limits are calculated, right? So HUD starts with the American Community Survey data, and this is going to be a little bit of a roller coaster as we talk through this. So stay with me. But first, we start with the American Community Survey data, which, as Mike said, was just released last month. And the ACS is very strong, one of the strongest ACS growths I think we've ever had. American Community Survey data at the national median income level is up 7.39%. So very, very strong increase. But this is where the inflation factor comes into account. As we said, this ACS data is from 2022, but we're talking about 2024 income limits. So HUD has to somehow get this historical ACS data forward to today's income limits. And how they do that is they use a CPI trend factor. What they look at is the change in CPI from 2022 to 2024 for this year's data. Whereas last year, they looked at the change in CPI from 2021 to 2023. And so let's first talk about this year. If we look at that trend factor of the 2022 data and the estimated 2024 CPI, right? Because we don't know 2024 CPI yet, but we do use, or HUD does use the Congressional Budget Office's estimate of 2024 CPI. And we see that that trend factor for this 2-year period is about 6.5%. So about 3.25% increase a year in CPI. So still increasing, still a strong 3% increase. But what's interesting, if we look at the trend factor that was used last year, which is that change in CPI from 2021 to 2023, and now we're probably forgetting 2021 now, but there's kind of a lot going on there. You might remember global pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you look at that skyrocketing CPI from 2021 to 2023, that trend factor was over 12% or 6% a year in an increase. And so now when we're taking this same trend factor and we're looking and saying, last year we trended it forward by 12%, and this year we're trending it forward by 6.5%, that even if your ACS data for your area stayed flat, because this trend factor is so much slower, it's still trending up, but so much slower, you actually have about a 5% decrease in your area median income just simply because just because that inflation factor is so much slower. So I said ACS is way up, 7.38% up, but now we have this 5% headwind that's kind of pushing us back down. So when we look across the country, at area median income, this results in about a 2% increase in area median income across the country, even though we had a 7.38% increase in the ACS data. And so if we look at this kind of, here's an example on the screen right now where we show this trend. So if we had $100,000 and we assume that it went up by 7% year over year, right, to take us to $107,000, when we trend those though, our AMI is actually going from 112,000 to 114,000. So only a 2% increase, even though we had a 7% increase in our underlying data. And so that's kind of what we're seeing across the board. So area median income, about a 2% increase. So now you're thinking, oh, Thomas, uh, does that mean I can only expect about a 2% increase in my income limits? And this is where things get complicated, is HUD doesn't stop at area median income. For tax credits, as Mike said, we use MTSP, but more specifically, we use what HUD calls very low income limits, or VLI, as I'll refer to it. And we continue to ride this roller coaster where I'm telling you, you're up 7%, you're down 5%, now you're up 2%. But when we look at very low income, and we'll talk about these adjustments in a second, the two biggest drivers on those. But once we factor in these adjustments that HUD applies, very low income, the income limits that will set the income limits and rent limits for tax rep programs, we're actually estimating on the areas that we can estimate as part of this Novogradac income limit estimator that we do, of the 1,500 plus areas that we can estimate, we're actually showing about a 7% increase in very low income. So back to good news, right? This little roller coaster here, or this trick or treat, if you will, to be on point for Halloween. And the reason for that is there's two adjusters that are having this very kind of big impact on VLI this year. And the first adjuster is what's called high housing cost areas. Now, if you want to know more about how high housing cost areas, find me somewhere and talk to me about. We're not going to delve in that today, but in these high housing cost areas, your income limits are driven off of HUD's published fair market rents. And if we look at fair market rents for the last 2 years, they've been growing at 10% a year on average. And so what's happened is fair market rents have been increasing at such a high rate that more areas are becoming quote unquote high housing cost areas, and more areas having their income driven by this increase in fair market rent. So your AMI may only be going up 2%, but if you're a high housing cost area and your fair market rent up by 10%, then your income limit will also increase by 10%, or maybe some component of there, depending on where you're at on this whole linear process of when you became a high housing cost area. So that's uh, adjustment number one that's helping drive a higher increase in very low income limits than area median income. Number two is something that we've talked about a lot, and that's the income limit caps. Last year, 85% of all areas were capped. And so what's happening this year is we are actually kind of chewing into that cap that we left over from last year. And so if we kind of look at an area, in the blog post that Mike referenced, we have 3 or 4 examples of different areas, how they're impacted on this. And again, I'm going to put one up here on the screen. It's probably too small to read, but it will tease you to go to our article. But for those who are just listening in the podcast, I'll walk you through it. So if we look at an area, last year it had a VLI that was capped at 48,750. But without the cap, if HUD had not capped income limits, it would have been 52,500. So you see there's a pretty big spread here between the capped amount and uncapped amount. And then we look at this area and we see, oh, for this area, it actually kind of underperformed. ACS only went up by about 4.5%. But then when we add that 4.5% increase in ACS and the 5% headwind trend factor, your AMI for this area actually is going down by 1%. But what's interesting is because of the impact of this cap, after we run it through the numbers, we come up with a VLI that's 52,150. So when you take that 52,150 and compare it to last year's 48,750, you look like you're having a 7% increase, even though all the underlying data says you should maybe be going down or have a very moderate increase. And it's because we're kind of chewing through that pent up cap from last year. And so it's allowing us to continue to have a steady increase in VLI. And we can talk, and we will talk about the caps, but that's the one silver lining of the caps this year, is that it's helping kind of absorb this strong headwind we have in this trend factor so that we result in still kind of steady increases in income and rent limits. Now, of course, I think we'd rather have had all the increase last year so that we'd know what it was. And, as we know, tax rep projects are held harmless. So any decrease this year we wouldn't feel. But all things being considered equal, it's not a bad thing that income limits are still continue to grow at a steady pace this year thanks to that cap.
So thank you for that explanation, and thanks for the graphics in the background there. It'll encourage folks to go to your blog post, as well as to maybe if you're listening but not watching on YouTube, you might go to the YouTube version to see the video background. But what you mentioned does dovetail nicely into the second of the two key takeaways, and that is how HUD determines the percentage cap on the allowable increase in income for a given area in a given year. And I thought it'd be useful if you shared with our listeners what some of the possible methodologies that HUD could adopt with respect to the annual percentage cap. And I do say some of the possible methodologies to foreshadow the fact that it's not a methodology that they've always used. So you can discuss, what some possible methodologies are.
Yeah. So first, let's just get grounded on the cap a little bit here. So the cap is the greater of 5% or two times the change in national median income. And HUD has been consistent in the wording there, but what they've changed is how they define the change in national median income. And if we look, and this change happened 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, they changed the definition to look at just the change in the ACS national median income for the two survey years. So again, for this year, we look at the change in ACS data from 21 to 22. So I mentioned earlier that change is 7.39%. And so that would result in a cap that, well, if we take that change times two, we end up at 14.78%, which is greater than 5%. So our cap under the methodology HUD has used the last 2 years would be just under 15%. So very strong increase. And what HUD did for the cap for the 2 years prior to that, they actually looked at that change in national median area median income. So not looking at the ACS data, but looking at ACS data that's been trended by this HUD trending factor. As I mentioned earlier, the change in national AMI is right around 2%. So again, 2% times 2 equals 4. But thankfully, in that case, it's the greater of 5% or that amount. So the HUD cap under the old method would be 5%. And you're probably sitting there thinking, well, Thomas, that's a big spread between 5% or 15%. And so what do we think HUD's going to do? Do we think they're going to use one of those two methods or come out with some sort of third method? I think to help inform this decision, and first off, I don't know what HUD's going to do. I wish I did. I think honestly, at this point, HUD probably doesn't even know what they're going to do yet
Right.
because they haven't dug into the data yet. They haven't looked at all their areas. They haven't decided what's reasonable. But if we look at what HUD kind of said last time when they changed the cap in 2021, one of their big reasons why they changed the cap is they were afraid that actual incomes of households were not increasing, but the calculation of area median income was being driven up by this huge increase in inflation. And that wasn't actually resulting in actual income limit or actual income increases. So they're afraid that they're going to increase income limits and therefore by proxy rent limits faster than tenants' actual incomes were increasing. That was going to cause issues in both the rental markets and people being able to pay their rent and who could qualify. But what's interesting, if we look now and look at the 2022 ACS data, we see incomes are going up, at least according to the American Community Survey, which is the survey HUD relies upon. And we see the incomes did go up by 7.39%. So I think that concern has largely been stripped away. So we see that income limits are truly increasing. So that leads me to think that HUD maybe doesn't need to do another tweak to their cap, that the current cap can stand. But the second part is HUD kind of informally and reading between the lines. We think that they were uncomfortable. The year they changed the cap would have been 25%. And this would have been, coming right off the pandemic. I think a lot of people were, I think people in the administration were concerned that a 25% increase in rent limits at that time would be too high. And that concern, I think, is still here, especially when we look at a 15% increase. Where is HUD or the administration comfortable with how big of an increase is okay? And so if I'm a developer, I think I'm looking here and saying, okay, I know that if I'm getting this projection, doing my calculation, and I'm showing an increase greater than 5%, I'm probably comfortable with 5% because we know that HUD's cap very clearly, states that the cap should be no less than 5%. but I'm not sure that I'm really comfortable saying I'm going to 100% underwrite this project at 14.78% increase if that's what my underlying data tells me. I think I'm probably going to use somewhere in between there, somewhere that I'm comfortable with, and I'm going to stress test this. But again, I think it's important to point out that capped areas, having a large number of areas capped, is, I don't think, good policy. So if HUD were to stick with this 5% cap, we mentioned and go back to the old methodology, right? Use a 5% cap. It's going to result in, again, a large percentage of areas being capped. Over 76% of areas that we can estimate would be subject to this cap. And if they continue to use the current cap of 14.78%, then we're back to only having about 10% of areas capped, which to me makes sense. Those are the outliers that we're trying to protect against. And so I think there's some strong reasons why HUD should go back or continue to use this higher cap, because caps, as we've discussed before, caps harm new development, right? If your income limits in your area are increasing by 10%, but you're capped at 5%, then your new project has lower achievable rents, can support less debt. It's more difficult for it to keep up with the inflationary pressure that's having. Caps also harm prospective tenants, right? If I'm a tenant looking to qualify and the income limit cap has been capped and I'm slightly above that, I'm not going to be able to qualify for assistance. Now, to be fair to HUD, caps obviously benefit existing tenants, right? If I'm already in a project, I want income limits to never increase because I want my rent to stay flat forever. So there's two sides to this discussion. So we have to be careful that, nothing happens in a vacuum here. But all things being equal, I think the ACS data shows us that incomes have increased. And so a cap that is, lower than that change in the ACS data, I think would be out of line with what the data is telling us. And so we're hopeful that HUD will pick the easiest answer of keeping what they have, but we don't know what they're going to do.
So thank you for that, Thomas. And it's not as if there could be a third version.
Yeah. Well, I
Uh,
mean, HUD could come up with something else. I just struggle to think, when during the pandemic, when we knew we didn't have 2020 ACS, we looked at all these different things that they could do. But when they have the ACS, it's hard to think that they're just going to go completely outside of
I agree.
the established norm. Yeah.
No, I agree with that. That's why I certainly agree with you that won't be less than 5%. Seems like a reasonably good bet. The question just is it 5%? Is it the 14.78% or some other number sort of in between? But the one issue I also want to get you to comment on, or maybe I could share some of my thoughts and have you share your thoughts on it, is, the issue of insurance costs is something that we're hearing a lot about now. And it is a hot topic and justifiably so. Insurance costs have been rising at some pretty notable percentage rates in a number of properties kind of across the country. And this is more than just an affordable housing issue. It's all rental properties, not just multifamily rental properties and homeowners and all the rest. But, there's also concerns about the availability of insurance in some areas. With all that being said, and with due deference to the significance of this issue of insurance costs, nominally speaking, HUD's cap and income limits can have a much more or greater financial effect on many properties. The point being that that whatever the increase in insurance costs are for a given property are small nominally relative to how HUD's cap and income limits is limiting rent growth. So maybe you could share your thoughts on that question, Thomas.
Yeah. So I agree. You can't go anywhere without somebody wanting to talk about insurance. We don't want to de-emphasize the impact that has on projects, right?
Right.
It's a very real increase. But I think the cap on income limits over the last 2 years has made the insurance increase be felt even more because our income limits have been held down. So our revenue's been held down. So we're more susceptible to pressure on the operation side, uh, especially with the cap. They lag below inflation in a couple of the recent years. And so this has really kind of made this insurance increase even more of a big impact. But, when I look at this, I say income limits drive so much more. Insurance is just kind of one of many uh, costs that we worry about. But income limits are basically all of your revenue. Or you might
Right.
have a little bit of commercial component, but by and large, it's all of your revenue. So when we kind of focus on this income limit issue, I think that it becomes more important. Let's take an example of Athens, Georgia. So last year, the HUD cap resulted in a two-bedroom rent being $200 than it would have been without the cap, $200 lower. Sorry. And let's say that's a
$200
100 unit a month per
a month
unit.
per unit.
Yeah. And so if this is a 100 unit project, right? That's $240,000 a year in lost revenue. Now, of course, you have the question of was that rent achievable, et cetera, but kind of ceteris paribus. This project had $240,000 less income because of the HUD cap. And that goes a long ways to covering increases in uh, insurance cost and other things like that. So that's why the income limits working group has been focused on this cap or this increase limit issue. But we're also very mindful of the fact that there are other factors that are really driving how successful a project may be. And so the working group right now is working on looking at this HUD cap and saying, should this floor of 5% that we referenced a couple of times today of saying that your income limit increase limit shall be no less than 5%, should that be more dynamic? And should we somehow be piggybacking off of all this kind of interest and insurance cost and saying that maybe this floor on the cap should be more dynamic and bring into account some either inflationary factor or peg it to the increase in insurance. Now, the hard part about pegging to the increase in insurance is how do you isolate that, especially on a data source that HUD would want to use. And so, one thing that we've kind of been bouncing around lately is maybe taking a number that HUD knows and actually publishes themselves, which is the operating cost adjustment factor known as OCAF. And maybe this floor should be tied to some component of OCAF. And so, we're saying that this floor should be dynamic and kind of because again, I think this is important to note when we're talking about this cap on income limits, the cap, you have to have income limits that are increasing higher than that for the cap to come into play. So we are artificially lowering income limits. So we're saying maybe in these areas that floor should be more dynamic and say that floor and the cap shouldn't be less than some component of inflation, some component of OCAF, so that we're saying that we understand projects are heavily impacted on the operating side. And so if we're capping income limits lower than inflation, that's a bad long-term strategy for projects. And so maybe that should be more dynamic. But that's kind of one of the things that the income limits working group is working on and noodling with as we kind of comment with HUD and kind of suggest different alternatives. And so if that's something that interests you, if you're one of the few interesting people like us who like to dig into these weird issues, I'd encourage you to join the working group and kind of continue this conversation with us.
So Thomas, tell me if you kind of agree with this or expand on it or otherwise sort of correct me. When I think about the 5%, I think, well, there's no magic to 5%.
Right.
When you think about the growth in rental income that a multifamily development has to have, it has to be growing, generally speaking, at least at the pace that operating expenses are growing on an annualized basis. And given that the income limits can be, up and down and it can vary a bit. Operating expenses tend to just rise every year. That you would think there'd be some metric as a percentage increase in operating expenses and then get some adjustment higher than the annual increase as your limit, because on a year-to-year basis, you don't know if the income limits will catch up and things of that nature. So you need a little bit of cushion there, which is why the OCAF number is something you look at, because that can be an operating expense kind of driven number. Not that there's anything particularly magical with that, but the idea is to get the income growing at a percentage that over multiple years will be more likely to be at a minimum matching the growth of operating expenses.
I think that's critical that it's some component of or multiplier of either OCAF or inflation, whatever we want to use for this inflation standpoint, because what happens if that floor is always at inflation, if your underlying data for 1 year is below that inflation, so your income limits only grow by 2%, but inflation was 5%, then the next year your income limits grow by 10%, but inflation's 5%, you're not catching up in real dollar terms because you're
Exactly.
still capped at this inflation. So there has to be some sort of multiplier of that in order for it to actually allow projects to kind of grow up and be healthy.
Right. No, that's exactly right, which is well said. So if I'm a developer, what is this? Any more thoughts? Kind of mentioned if you're a developer, you can kind of count on 5%. It might be more. As-
Well, Well, sorry, as your cap, you can count 5%. But let's talk about if I'm a developer, how am I parsing this news? So I'm sitting here and saying, okay, Thomas told me that on average, we're going up 7%. And so that's good news for the most part, right? But we need to understand where you're falling in this average. Is when we look at the areas we can estimate, right? 3% of areas are having a decrease. Now, that's not a large percentage of areas, but if your project's in that area, you'd
It's
probably like to know that,
100%.
right? Uh, and we look and
Right.
say that it's impressive that 11% are increasing at over 14%. So understanding where you lie in there, I think, is really important when you're looking at your project and figuring out how you're going to underwrite this. And once you kind of understand where you lie, think about stress testing that, right? So if I'm at a 7% increase, I need to stress test and say, well, what happens if I'm at 5%? Do I still feel comfortable with this project? Now, the good news is probably most of your underwriting guidelines had you at 3% anyway. So, but we're only trending expenses at 3%. So, obviously we have much more pressure on our expense side. So looking at how you're trending those things and whether it's a new project or existing project and understanding what this means, because it might change what capital needs improvements you do in the next year. It might change which projects you pick for resyndication. It has a lot of kind of different impact on your whole portfolio. So really understanding what's happening to your specific project, I think is really, really important. And this 2020 ACS data allows us to start doing these estimates for 2024. So we have some kind of more grounded in reality numbers to look at for your projects.
So thank you for that, Thomas. Before I let you go, I did want to also have you discuss some of the other effects of HUD's annual or HUD's cap on income limits, other areas that our listeners might be interested in. We've talked about the impact it has directly in terms of the incomes, the maximum incomes a tenant can earn and still be eligible, as well as the maximum rents that a property owner can charge the tenants. But there's other derivative effects that you could discuss some of them.
I think the biggest one I'd point out right now is for DDAs and QCTs, so difficult to develop areas and qualified census tract. Again, if your project's located in one of these areas, you receive a 30% boost in your eligible basis, which usually results in a 30% boost in your credits and equity. And so whether your project is located in one of these areas is absolutely critical to the feasibility of many projects. But when HUD does these calculations, they're using capped income limits. And so we actually have a blog post that I finished final review on the edits today. So hopefully it'll be up tomorrow or the next day, but it's definitely sometime this week. And we look at the areas that are impacted. And let's talk about DDAs first. When we just look at the DDAs, there's 279 areas that were designated as a DDA that would not have been a DDA if HUD had not used capped income limits. And on the flip side, there's 232 areas that would have been a DDA had HUD used uncapped income limits. So it totally shifts where projects are being built. And there's not much you can do about that because HUD publishes DDAs and we are talking to them about whether or not a capped amount should be used. HUD has kind of informally stated they think the capped amount is correct, but that's an area that's being impacted by these caps and the income limits. And then same thing on qualified census tracts, but on DDAs are a zero sum game. We designate 20% of the population. But on qualified census tracts, it's not a zero sum game. And so if an area was using an uncapped income limit as part of this component of the calculation, which and you can read my blog post to go into the details on that, but basically more areas would qualify. And our rough estimate is that over 1,000 areas would qualify for qualified census tract that are not currently qualified census tracts had HUD used an uncapped amount. And so it's very interesting to see this kind of HUD policy, as I mentioned, impacted the rent in Athens. It impacted the qualified census tracts across the country. And so this policy never happens in isolation and it kind of trickles out to all these different areas.
And I would just add to that, Thomas, that this is sort of most notable when it comes to private activity bond finance developments. On the 9% side, we're getting allocated credit from the state agency or the allocating agency if they're not a state. They have the ability to deem you to be in a DDA. So you can get that 30% boost. But if you're a private activity bond finance development, then you don't have that right. So there you're just, like you said, there's 1,000 areas that won't get the boost, that might otherwise get the boost, that a project might otherwise be financially feasible. That's not feasible now because they don't get the boost.
Yeah, and I think just to drive home how important the boost is, if you look at the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, how many of those provisions are talking about ways to expand that boost to make more bond finance projects feasible in areas of the country where maybe they're not currently feasible. So it's a very important and very on top of Congress's mind.
And then even to further unpack it, when I talk about private activity bond finance projects being feasible, particularly focused on new construction, private activity bond finance projects, as opposed to acquisition rehab. We've definitely seen a downtick in new construction, private activity bond finance projects because of the rate inflation, higher interest rates and the like. So that if ever there were the time to really need the boost in areas that aren't qualified for the boost, now would be the time. So, Thomas, I appreciate being on the podcast. I did want to give you a chance to share with our listeners some other resources that would be available to them that we haven't mentioned already, or to plug ones we've already mentioned.
Yeah, so I mentioned blog posts. I actually wrote 3 over the last week and a half or 2 weeks. So if you're interested in QCTs, DDAs, be sure and look for those too. But more importantly is the blog post on the American Community Survey data that goes into a lot of what we talked about today with some real life examples that you can look through. Again, if you're interested in this, join the working group. You joining that helps us be able to tackle these difficult issues with HUD and also have a broader base of users when we go to submit comments to HUD and attend obviously we have our conference coming up in November, December. So the Thursday, Friday of the last week of November in Las Vegas, where we'll be talking about all these issues. And then the final thing I want to remind people about HUD income limits is we are anticipating an April 1st release date. That's what HUD stated. But if there's a government shutdown, that will likely go out the window. Last time when we had a government shutdown at the start of the year, the income limits were delayed basically day for day for that shutdown. So I think that we should just be
Good
aware of
point.
that as we're kind of tagging increases for April 1st, that is potentially a moving date.
I would just note there that from a government shutdown perspective, the government is funded through November 17th. I would say the general consensus is that there'll be some sort of a continuing resolution extending to early January to mid-January, I should say. There's some that think it could go to April, some say December. But with a new speaker now in the House, there's this general expectation that to give them some room to operate, there'll be this extension. And then the question will just become in January or whenever it gets extended to, is there a shutdown then? And we'll have to wait and see. So thank you, Thomas. Thank you for joining me on the podcast. Do stick around for the off mic section. And as you know, I get to ask you some off-topic questions and get some advice from you. And because you're such a frequent guest, we have to think of new topics to ask. And I would like to encourage our audience to tune in again next week into all future episodes of Tax Credit Tuesday. Do follow us or subscribe to us, however you get your podcast, to make sure you don't miss an episode. And as always, if you have an idea or suggestion for a future episode, please email us at cpas@novoco.com. Okay, Thomas, we turn now to our hot mic section. I wanted to ask you a question, which I have asked others, but hopefully I've not asked you this before. I don't think I have. What professional advice would you give the 25-year-old version of yourself? Which is, I guess, a way of saying you're not 25, but you already mentioned you were 20 years at Novogradac and you didn't start in elementary school or preschool. So what professional advice would you give to the 25-year-old version of yourself?
Yeah, since I'm not Doogie Howser CPA, I have not been, I did not start when I was 5. I think to me, if I look back at my success at Novogradac and Company, my advice would be become an expert in something. Because when you become an expert in something, you become a resource to people. And therefore, people that you normally may not talk to are going to come to you and ask you questions. And it's a great way to meet people inside your company, great way to meet people outside your company, and great way to really kind of develop your professional network, but also develop your skills and marketability. And so definitely for me, that's been a success. I started out becoming an expert in compliance, then income limits, then acquisition rehab, and we can kind of go on and on over my 20 years, but
Yes.
definitely become that expert in something. And, you know, to me, the other thing, the easiest way to become that expert in something is wait for something new to come out. Like in 2008, when HERA came out, I was instantly able to be the expert in HERA income limits because nobody else had an advantage on me. I'm probably never going to catch up to Mike on his expertise in 704B partnership basis because he had a at least 20-year head start on me. But on things like that change, it's really your opportunity to take that chance and dig in deep on it and become that expert. And nobody has a head start on you.
Now, that is the great equalizer, if you will, in the sense that no one has a head start on you because no one else has built a review before. It also sort of gives you, by being an expert at something, it gives you like a foundation to build off of, and then you can become expert at others tangentially to it and all the rest, and you kind of build sort of center out. So it is Halloween. So I figured I'd ask you sort of a layup question, which is, what's your favorite Halloween candy or candies?
Well, for me, it's the miniature Take 5 bar. So I don't know if you know the Take 5. It has pretzel in it and caramel and chocolate.
I do
Just a
not.
really good flavor combination. So Take 5, it's an underrated choice. I figure everybody's going to take the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup first. But I actually asked my 3 kids who are at home today that hadn't left to school yet. When I asked my oldest who was home, said the 100 grand. Apparently, our kids are very controversial or don't go with the flow on their takes.
Okay.
And then the other 2 said Kit Kat. So there you
Kit
go.
Kat.
That's the Stagg family candy ranking for those of you who are playing along at home.
Well, mine would be Reese's Pieces. So, or I'll date myself and say Junior Mints, which is that really a candy? That's what my kids would say.
I won't mention this, but the 90-year-old couple that lived behind us, they were giving out Junior Mints. So that age is more.
That's what I meant. That or Yorkshire or York's patties, York type of patties. Very good. Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks, Mike.
For joining us. And to our listeners, I'm Mike Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.